Η επόμενη ομιλήτρια είναι η Δόκτωρ Christinne Chaillot. Δόκτωρ Chaillot, έχετε το λόγο.
Good afternoon. I was asked to speak about the question of the human rights of the Christians in the Middle East, which of course is a very large topic, and of course it's not because the region is more quiet than the problems of the Christians in the Middle East are settled, far from that. So I asked to speak about the topic of the human rights of the Copts in Egypt, because it's really the region and the country where the Christians have attacks until today, and I thought it was better to concentrate on a very alive problem. So, as you may know, in history, Copts were subjects to forms of repression, and they were marked by dimitude and by what is called the poll taxes. But nevertheless, we have to recognize that in the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century, the situation of the Christians in Egypt was much better. And we can say that it's since the 1970s that the Copts have suffered regular attacks, some by the Islamic State, who claimed even responsibility for operations targeting Copts. I remind you that the Coptic Orthodox Church is the largest Christian community in the Middle East, about 10% of the population of Egypt, that is about 8 million. We don't have any very strict statistics. Even recently, in November 2018, at least 7 Copts who were pilgrims to the monastery of Saint Samuel, that is in the western desert of Egypt, near the Libyan border. So these Copts were killed and about 20 were injured, including several in critical condition. In 2017, that is 1 year ago, in May, 29 pilgrims, Coptic pilgrims, going to the same monastery of Saint Samuel were killed by Islamists and 28 injured. In April 2017, the Islamic group claimed responsibility to the twin Palm Sunday bombings that target the St. George Church in Tanta and St. Mark Church in Alexandria during celebrations for the Coptic Holy Week, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries. In December 2016, there was also a very bad event in Cairo, in St. Paul and St. Peter Church, which is just about 5 meters away from the Coptic Orthodox Cathedral of St. Mark in Cairo. And with this bombing, 25 people were killed and dozens were injured. So we can say that fear continues to permeate the Christian community in Egypt. And it seems that the Egyptian government continually fails to protect its Coptic, that is, its Christian citizens. So we can say that NGOs like the Coptic Solidarity in the USA held the Egyptian government fully responsible and called for a transparent investigation of these attacks and to institute serious measures to prevent future attacks. In 2018, Egypt was ranked 17th on Christian support organization Open Doors World Watch List of the countries where it is most difficult to be a Christian. So in my book, Les Coptes d'Égypte, Discrimination and Persecution, 1970-2011, which was first published in 2011, that is just after the fall of Mubarak. I give a kind of file as well as a short history from which I have drawn some material for use in this paper. From what point in time can one speak of persecution, and what definition should one give of this word? And after reading different definitions in various dictionaries, persecution might be summarized as follows in our case: oppression against Coptic Christians for religious reasons through unjust, cruel, systematic and violent treatment organized by the state or by religious groups to the point of arresting or even killing such people. However, it is not always easy to draw a line between discrimination and persecution. For example, if one considers that unjust treatment is in effect already persecution. Thus, certain examples of discriminations could be considered by some people as persecution. That was the case of Alain Roussillon, the previous director of CEDEJ, that is le Centre d'études et de documentation économique et juridique in Cairo, who was himself using the word persecution in an article on the Coptic question. In the last 20 years, the Islamization of Egyptian society is very evident, probably supported by the addition of Article 2 to the Constitution of 1980. That is, when Islamic law, that is Sharia, then became the main source of the Constitution, the Egyptian Constitution. There is no need of advanced sociological study to understand this. It is enough when you move around in Cairo, when you walk in the street, when you take the underground, to see the veiled women or men with the zebiba, that is the sign on their foreheads, or observe the widespread construction of mosques. In daily life, the Copts complain about numerous examples of harassment, vexation, and marginalization, as well as discrimination. For example, over finding a job or a home, in the workplace, in educating their children in a Christian way, in their professional advancement, and so on. In the public sector, Christians are underrepresented in the police, the army, the civil service, and the law courts, in the educational system and other government functions, as well as in the higher positions in universities, medicine, and the media, where Copts are often excluded from key positions. At the religious level, a church cannot be built without a presidential decree. It is not easy to get such permits to build or restore churches. It can take years with endless red tape, and sometimes nothing is obtained. Religious affiliation is mentioned in identity and other official papers. This can lead to prejudice against Christians, for example, when people sit university exams or seek a job. As for conversions, of course, Muslims are forbidden to change their religion. If they do, they suffer the consequences of having become apostates. Christians are allowed to convert to Islam. In that case, their children automatically become Muslim. An intimate relationship between a Muslim and a Christian can cause conflicts between the two faith communities, and some Muslims consider this as an insult to Islam. Especially since the end of the 1990s, stories circulate about the kidnapping of young Coptic women, rape, forced marriages, and women disappearing for good. These stories surely indicate another form of persecution. The education system in Egypt here deserves critical mention. Teachers hardly touch on Coptic history and culture in the curriculum, while lessons in Arabic language include the compulsory study of a number of Muslim religious texts. The media, that is newspapers, television, satellite channels, radio, internet sites, as well as chat rooms and talks, can be very hostile to Copts. For example, some very popular programs attack the Christian faith and present Christianity as evil. In the media, events are often narrated in a fiery and exaggerated way in order to provoke an atmosphere of hatred. This also happens via books, CDs, tapes, and internet. Some totally distort the truth. One could find many other examples to show such discrimination. It is undeniable that Christians are placed under moral pressures, are faced with irrationally violent hate talk, that hostile rumors and made-up scandals are circulated against them, that facts are distorted so that one cannot get at the whole truth. So I am afraid that we don't have so much time to speak of the recent history, but we should, as I said before, these events began in the 1970s. The first significant attack took place in November 1972 in Kanka, North Cairo, when about 50 people were killed. And between 1977 and 1980, several violent attacks took place. Copts were killed and churches were burned in Cairo, Alexandria, as well as in Upper Egypt. In September 1981, President Sadat had about 1,500 people arrested, and among them were 150 Copts. Of whom 8 were bishops and 13 priests. Pope Shenouda himself was put under house arrest for 3 years and 3.5 years. With the arrival in power of President Mubarak, incidents continued. For example, in 1981, Asyut fell almost completely under the control of the local Islamist organization called Jihad. I leave for the time being the other examples, and just to mention that in October 2005 the worst violence happened in Alexandria when 3 people were killed and over 100 were wounded. 8 churches were attacked and shops and cars belonging to Copts were destroyed. Since 2009, observers note that the number of violent incidents against Copts has risen even more, and among the most violent events I shall mention those in Nag Hammadi in 2010 and in Alexandria in 2011. Nearly all attacks remain unpunished, and they are often explained away with lies. Frequently, reconciliation encounters organized by the authorities, which should be a positive event, turned out to be useless and farcical parodies. In my book, I made a short list of these acts of violence, and in the future, I think that a systematic list of all these attacks should be established year by year, case by case, with the exact number of victims, as this represents not only a question of human rights, but also an aspect of the contemporary history of the Copts. Each event should be verified on the spot. Some NGOs and internet sites, Coptic and others, have attempted to make such a list, but never in a complete way. So, as I said, in the 1990s, when several Islamist groups wished to enforce the Islamic law, that is Sharia, and impose the jizya tax in Upper Egypt, especially in the region of Asyut, and already before the 2011 revolution, and especially just after the 2000 revolution, violence was employed by some Islamists especially by some Salafists. Even though the armed infrastructures of the most radical Islamist groups were largely eradicated in 1998, their violence continued. And Guillaume March, who is a French researcher, concluded his article by saying that, I quote, "Hatred against the Copts was the cement of radical Islamism in Asyut," end of quote. Now, what is paradoxal is that these attacks of all kinds against the Copts continued in a particularly violent manner after the 2011 revolution, at that time carried out mainly by some Salafists. It was a direct and organized persecution, and, well, again, I don't want to quote some events because we don't have time for that. So how to answer to this discrimination and persecution? Of course, we have the reaction of the diaspora, the Coptic diaspora. We have, of course, some associations who are defending the rights of the Copts in Egypt. Like one famous one is the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. You have also, of course, the human rights sessions of the United Nations. I explained the details of what happens during these sessions at the United Nations, which take place in the UN in Geneva, which is my hometown. I happened to go to such sessions, and in fact, I also had interviews at the European Union, which is of course more neutral, but I would say that in conclusion, the UN and the European Union have in the past collaborated with Egypt on development, peace and cooperation. But at the level of the UN, it is hard to believe that action will be taken in order to defend the rights of the Christians in Egypt and in the Middle East, partly because the lobbies of the Muslim countries at the UN are extremely powerful. In the European Union, there are obviously more neutral parties which could defend the Coptic cause, but we must admit that the European Union has not really been active during the problems of the Christians in the Middle East in the last years. In fact, we have to come to the conclusion that in general a culture of tolerance and equality, including education in human rights, should be promoted. In any case, one has to denounce a culture of hatred. One could also expect self-criticism to be an integral feature along with integrity and democracy. And of course, religious freedom is at the heart of our questions. And another fundamental question is whether sectarian tensions can really be diffused. It is only on the basis of real equality for all citizens that nationally in Egypt can be built up. And above all, the mindset has to be changed. And of course, this is not an easy matter. So as Ken Brown wrote in 2000, and this is, I think, still valid for today, to fight violence does nothing to combat the ideology behind the violence. That traditional Islam, with all its discriminatory effects on non-Muslims, should be reinstated as the foundations of Egypt's society and culture. Thus, the violence, no matter how fiercely combated, will continue to appear so long as the ideology exists. And this is so difficult, as you can imagine, to fight ideology. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε θερμά την Δόκτωρ Chaillot για την πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα παρουσίασή της.